Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. In this video, I'm going to go over the principle of improbable complexity. The principle of improbable complexity says that when you look at everything that is possible, the simple possibilities greatly outnumber the more complex possibilities. Thus, the more complex things are more improbable than the simpler things. Now, the truth of this can be demonstrated very simply with um, a die. You can look at a die as a random number generator from 1 to 6. And for any roll of the die, the odds of getting any one particular number between 1 and 6 is 6 to the power of 1. So your odds are 1 in 6. So let's say rolling is 6. Now, what are the odds of rolling 2 6s? Well, that would be 6 to the power of 2. So your odds would be 1 in 36. Now, what if you wanted to roll 6 6s? You want to roll this die 6 times and get 6 each time you roll it. Then your odds are 6 to the power of 6. Or 1 in, I believe it's 46,500. So you get the idea. Let me check that. So 6 times 6 times 6 times 6 times 6 times 6 equals, 1 in 46,656. And if you're wanting to roll 7 6s in a row, it would be 6 to the power of 7. We'll just multiply that by 6 and we get 1 in 279,936. So if you look at a 6 on a die and you look at 6 6s, rolling it 6 times, getting 6 each time, 6 6s, that is a level of complexity. It's more complex than, let's say, rolling the same die 6 times and getting any number in no particular order those 6 times. So 6 6s is more complex than just some random number of 6 rolls. Let's say 1 3 6 5 4 1. This is a much more complex result. Its structure is more complex, more against the odds, more unlikely, more improbable than this result. These sorts of results are far more likely and probable than the improbable results. Just based on the whole realm of possibility, when you're rolling a die some number of times, you can tell that you're far more likely to get a simple sequence or a simple structure than a complicated structure. This is the nature of possibility. When you talk about the realm of all that is possible, it is a principle of that realm that as complexity gets greater, the probability of that complexity arising becomes less and less and less. This is the principle of improbable complexity. Now, when talking about God's power to create physical reality, this is an uncaused power. God is an uncaused being, meaning God has no cause. There is no cause for God's existence. God did not come from something. God did not come from nothing. God always was. Is not a being with origination. Because God is uncaused, God cannot be made of parts. Um, if he was made of parts, he'd be caused by those parts. So we call this idea that God is not made of parts divine simplicity. However, because God is uncaused, God's nature is also uncaused. And part of that nature includes God's power to create physical reality. That power to create physical reality is uncaused. It's not made of parts. It can't be altered or changed or destroyed. Destruction is the disassociation of parts. So something that is divinely simple and doesn't have parts cannot be destroyed. But it also can't be changed because anything that changes has parts. And God doesn't have parts that God can't change, and neither can God's power to create physical reality. It's an unchanging power. It cannot be altered, cannot be destroyed, it cannot be broadened or shrunk. It is what it is, and it can be only that. So, this idea that uh, God can't change is what we call the doctrine of divine immutability. So, God's power to create physical reality is immutable, it can't change. God doesn't create his power to create physical reality, God can't alter his power to create physical reality. God can simply use his power, but he can't change it. So, when God creates physical reality, he has an uncaused toolbox in which to create physical reality. He can't change that toolbox. The tools that are in that toolbox, that's all he gets. His only choice is, do I use them and how do I use them? But he can't change the tools. He can't increase their number or decrease their number. Now, from observing the universe, we know what some of these tools are in his toolbox, such as atoms and energy. Um, I don't pretend to know all the tools that are in God's toolbox for creating physical reality. We know some of them, but I can't say it's immutable. It can't be changed. So whatever's in there, that's all that can be in there, and even God can't change that fact. So God has to use the tools in his immutable toolbox to create physical reality. God has no choice. It's an uncaused toolbox. It's an uncaused power to create physical reality. God is stuck with that power. Can't be changed. And um, one of the issues with this power is this power involves the ability to create any and all logical possibilities in physical reality, which is an infinite number. So it includes everything that is logically possible for physical reality, which is an infinite amount. So when you're talking about everything or everythingness, as I've described this concept in the cosmological argument, the dichotomy of existence, you're dealing with this infinite range of all that is possible, all possibility. But that everythingness is subject to the principle of improbable complexity, just like rolling dice. Now, I'm not saying God rolls dice. God is quite purposeful in what he creates. He doesn't roll dice. But this is just an example to show you this principle of improbable complexity and how that would apply to the realm of everythingness, which means that God can't change this principle, which means he has to create using it. And that has consequences. And the major consequence is that when God creates physical reality, the simple must always greatly outnumber the complex. It's a logical consequence of, of everything that is possible, or probabilities, or in the realm of everythingness, uh, complex things are always greatly outnumbered by simple things. You can think of it, another way to think of it is like, think of a car, all right? A car is a highly complex machine. Now, that's just one car. Now take that car and rip it apart. Rip it into all its parts and spread them all over the place. Now you have hundreds, thousands of individual parts after you took this one car apart. But now you've got thousands of pieces to this car. But those pieces themselves are simpler than the car itself, which was the ultimate complexity. Now you can take those parts, those thousands of parts, and you could break them down even further into even smaller pieces. You could break them down into their individual molecules or their individual atoms. And now you've got trillions and quadrillions of these simple parts that used to be this car. This one car is now an unbelievable number of atoms and molecules. But these atoms and molecules, they're simple things. The simplicity has uh, come down to this. You went from a one complex car to trillions, quadrillions, who knows how many simple atoms or molecules. And that's a demonstration of this principle of improbable complexity. So it takes quadrillions of simple atoms and molecules to create one complex thing like a car. And this is a simple logical result of this principle of improbable complexity. So God can't escape that principle of improbable complexity. It's part of the uncaused power to create physical reality. Um, so God uses simple things like atoms and energy to create more complex things. But the atoms and the energy will always greatly outnumber the complex things. Now, this is not a knock on God's omnipotence. Uh, this is a logical consequence of the power to create, the uncaused power to create. There is no power that can circumvent the principle of improbable complexity. Therefore, any uh, power that claims that it can get around this is an illusory power. It's an impossible power. It's a fake power. And God can't be knocked for not having an illusory or an impossible power. That doesn't make him not omnipotent. It just means it means you're claiming God has a power which doesn't exist. Well, that's not a knock on omnipotence. He has all real powers that exist, not illusory or fake powers or illusory powers. Um, so this is not a knock on God's omnipotence. it's just a consequence, a logical consequence of this idea of complexity and simplicity, and how simplicity always greatly outnumbers complexity. So when it comes to creating complex things, God always has to deal with this principle of improbable complexity. So what that means is, even though God can do anything that's logically possible with the snap of his fingers, even a highly complex thing, uh, he still has to deal with this essentially this proportionality of simplicity and complexity. The simple must always greatly outnumber the complex. So this is why things like miracles are so few and far between, because miracles are highly complex things. Now, they're not complex in the terms that it's harder for God to create them. He can still do them with the snap of his proverbial fingers, but they're complex in the sense that miracles require an alteration of the ordinary laws of physics and the ordinary laws of nature, in the area surrounding where the miracle is occurring. That requires a change in the laws of the universe and laws of physics to allow for this highly complex and improbable thing we call a miracle to occur. So miracles are very complex in that sense. They're highly complex in the terms of in the principle of improbable complexity. Those are very complex things. So they can't happen as often. Uh, they're like all these sixes coming up instead of just a general set of numbers. So that's why they're few and far between. God can do miracles whenever he wants, but they're subject to the principle of um, improbable complexity, and that's why miracles are few and far between. So when you're asking for, when you're complaining that God doesn't do these improbable things, these highly complex things, such as miracles in your life or giving you what you want despite the laws of nature and the laws of physics, remember that God's power is uncaused and it is subject to this principle of improbable complexity. And that's why God rarely grants miracles. Now, it's interesting because uh, an afterlife, for instance, in heaven is a much more complicated place than the universe. And that's because there's all sorts of supernatural phenomenon that occurs in an afterlife or heaven or hell. And in order to make those alterations to the the laws of physics of those realms, you have to engage in high complexity. So perhaps God is offsetting the complexity of those realms with the much more simpler, the simplicity of greater realms, such as our universe or other universes, in order to comply with this principle of improbable complexity. That would explain why we're born in this universe, which is much more simpler. The laws of physics are simpler, um, but then we are transferred. Our consciousness and our body is transferred to a much more complex realm of a heaven or a hell. But we start in the much more simpler realm of the universe. So maybe that's why we start life here. And then when we die, we eventually go to this much more complicated realm, perhaps due to this principle, which means we basically have to start here. God has to start us in the universe in order to raise us to a higher and more complex realm, because he needs the simplicity of the universe or other universes in order to comply with this principle, in order to give us some place like a heaven or a hell, which is more complex. Uh, that's just speculation, but it's interesting speculation. But this principle really is true. And you can tell just by rolling a die a certain number of times that this is, in fact, a real principle. And in the terms of everythingness, that is, God is capable of creating the infinite logical possibilities for physical reality. So that is a realm of infinite possibilities, which should be subject to this principle of improbable um, complexity. So this should apply to God's uncaused power to create. So it does have implications. We can speculate about what those implications are, and I did in this video. But it is, I think, an important principle to understand about God's uncaused power to create physical reality, which is part of the doctrine of divine immutability. All right. Hope you learned something, and take care.